Over the weekend, there was panic in various states throughout the country as federal agents conducted a number of enforcement raids in at least 6 states. Now, more data has come out in regard to this, and it turns out that these raids took place in as many as 11 states, and they arrested a total of about 600 people. Now, the Department of Homeland Security is saying that 75% of the individuals who were detained had convictions or prior convictions, but the rest did not. So there are a lot of myths in regard to what happened over the weekend, and so I'm going to compare both the Trump administration and the Obama administration and kind of give you a fair and balanced view of what happened, okay? So first of all, let me just say, when the raids first started happening, and of course news spread through social media, I panicked because you didn't really hear too much about the raids that happened under Obama's administration. But before I get into the details of what's happening under Trump's administration, just know that Obama did a ton of these raids as well. In fact, in 2012, he detained about 400,000 individuals, and he did deport 2 million over the course of his presidency.
So just real quick, on the federal court case that Trump has in regards to the travel ban, I explained in a video I did over the weekend that, look, I can't stand the travel ban. I think it's terrible, terrible policy. But he might actually win the court case once the court actually hears the full case. And some people are like, well, I don't get it. Are you for Trump or against Trump? No, that's not how it works. You judge case by case. So if he gets rid of the TPP, that's great. I'm not going to criticize him because I'm on the other team. It doesn't work that way. So in this case, yeah, you know, we can disagree with what Trump did, and we will. But you also have to know the real facts. So in the case of the travel ban, Obama's travel ban was much different than Donald Trump's, and we give you the real facts on this. And in this case, well, we've got the facts on this, and then you decide which way you want to go with it.
So there are similarities in that Obama aggressively also went after undocumented immigrants. Obama also did these raids, but the raids usually took place in the middle of the night. And Trump's administration has decided to do these raids in the middle of the day, kind of to send a strong message to undocumented immigrants in the country and show that he's planning on being a little more harsh. Now, he's also broadened the profile of individuals that ICE should go after. So let me give you the details on that. Now, first, immigration officials confirmed that agents this week raided homes and workplaces in Atlanta, Chicago, New York, the Los Angeles area, North Carolina, and South Carolina, netting hundreds of people. Again, around 600 people were arrested. Now, last month, Trump substantially broadened the scope of who the Department of Homeland Security can target to include those with minor offenses or no convictions at all. Now, again, the Department of Homeland Security says that 75% of the people that they detained had prior convictions. The rest, no, not really. Those are individuals that wouldn't be targeted under Obama's administration. But nonetheless, to be fair and very clear, these types of raids did happen in the previous administration as well.
So, first of all, I don't care if they have it at night or the day. That's just photo ops. Who cares? I care more about the policy. Second of all, we told you 100 times that Barack Obama had broken the record on deportations. Deported over 2 million people under his watch, much more than George W. Bush. So, if you've been watching the Young Turks, that is not news to you. And then, of course, he did that because he thought, oh, the Democrats will get some Republican votes. How'd that turn out? He had been, by a lot of immigration experts' estimations, draconian in how much he went after immigrants here in this country. So, and then, by the way, lo and behold, the Democratic nominee did not get as high a vote in the Latino community as she thought she was going to, because they see this, apparently with Obama, night in, night out. So now, of course, Trump takes it to 11. Right?
Exactly.
Takes it to a next level and even worse.
So immigration officials acknowledged that as a result of Trump's executive order, authorities had cast a wider net than they would have last year. So they're saying, look, we're targeting more people than before. But they're also saying, well, the majority of people that we have targeted, 75%, had criminal convictions. So there were some, anecdotes that were shared in the media. One case of someone who was a gang member from El Salvador. That person got detained and deported back to his country. But It is interesting to see the type of reaction these raids are getting as opposed to the raids under Obama. Now, under Obama, the raids happened and you didn't see as much criticism from the left. The raids are happening under Trump's administration. Again, they're accelerated, they're amplified, and there's panic everywhere, right? So I don't like that double standard, okay? There should be panic in both cases, especially if the raids are targeting people who aren't criminals. And by the way, anyone who's here in an undocumented fashion is breaking the law, right? So they're all considered criminals in one way or another. I don't agree with targeting people who are here and they don't get involved in criminal or violent activity, but I mean, under Trump's definition, anyone who's here and anyone who's undocumented while they're here is a criminal.
And so there's a difference between undocumented and illegal, and immigration advocates would, strongly argue that what they're doing is coming in without papers. That's true, but that is not necessarily illegal in and of itself. Now, Trump does not, as Anna just pointed out, doesn't agree with that and says if you come here, it is by definition illegal and hence you're a criminal, right? So that is a totally different standard. Now, look, again, what do I think? When Obama wanted to find felons, people who had actually broken a law here, a serious law, and it was a felony, and wanted to deport them, no problem, okay? Of course, I totally agree with that, and I think most reasonable Americans would agree with that. You came here, you broke a serious law, you gotta go, okay? You were here undocumented in the first place, and then you're committing criminal activity. That's not a close call, okay? So now when you say, all right, now we're gonna go to misdemeanors, and then we're gonna go to things, other infractions, and hey, you got a speeding ticket once. Okay, that's an infraction. Now we're getting to a point where it's a little bit more reign of terror, to be honest, right? And it affects so many families. Then when you say, okay, now everybody's illegal by definition, well, then you can't go any broader than that. And that means you're going to try to root out 11 to 12 million people here and somehow kick them all out. Now, to be fair to Trump, and actually I've now seen anecdotal evidence of his voters and independents saying, hey, you know what? That's what we voted for. And he's a rare guy who's doing what he said he was going to do. Most politicians come into office and do the opposite. He told you he was going to kick him out, and he's kicking him out. So where's the panic coming from? I agree with you. It's terrible, terrible policy. I didn't like it under Obama. Now that Trump has made it much broader, I hate it under Trump.
Right.
But that's what he said he was going to do. That's why we told you to vote against him.
Right. Well, I think that there was this widespread idea during the election that Donald Trump was just the kind of person who would say crazy things and he would never follow through on it. But now we know, without a shadow of a doubt, that he follows through on his promises. And this is one of the more concerning promises, especially when you think about, just how nuanced an issue like this is. People like to think of things as black and white, like immigrants bad or immigrants good. No, it's way more nuanced than that. If you look at the GDP in California alone, undocumented immigrants contribute billions of dollars, right, to our economy. And that's the reason why state lawmakers wanted to make California a sanctuary state. Now, it doesn't matter what state lawmakers want, because if the feds want to come in and do these raids, they can go ahead and come in and do these raids. I think that's one of the reasons why California was targeted. But again, these are people, the law-abiding immigrants, these are people who are contributing to the economy, and a lot of businesses would be in a lot of trouble if they all got deported.
So let me say the last couple of things here. I'm going to be really interested in what happens when that situation happens that Anna just pointed out. When the rubber hits the road and all of a sudden, because they've done this before in some of the southern states, they kicked out all the undocumented immigrants and then panicked because nobody was working at the factory. No matter how high they paid, they couldn't get people to work at the factories or the farms. And so then they had to bring them back. So when he goes to kick them out in mass scale, he might get more than he bargained for. Number two, he keeps half his promises. Let's be clear about that. So the draconian promises he does keep. Talking about draining the swamp, that promise, not so much.
That's like the most important promise that he didn't follow through on.
Yeah,
right.
The corruption he's totally in favor of, and he stacked this cabinet with Republican donors who are looting the place as we speak. Finally, credit to some progressives, including the ones that voted for Jill Stein. Now, I think they voted in the wrong direction. That's my opinion. I made that clear before the election, et cetera, especially in swing states. But they said at least it might wake people up. And under Obama, and if Hillary Clinton had gotten elected, under Hillary Clinton, you'd still be asleep. You would have never heard of the raids because they happen in the middle of the night, and it's okay. It's a friendly Democratic president kicking out Latinos. And some of them deserved it, others, I don't know, what are you going to do? It's okay, it's a Democratic president. Don't, settle down, everybody. Well, now when it's a Republican president, everybody's flipping out. You should have been flipping out all along. You know who created journalism you could be proud of? You did. Our audience helped us hire an investigative reporting team. Now we're going to go for a second. tytnetwork.com/go. Let's build the best reporting team in the country together.